Today, I'm going to tell you a story. All right, today we're going to talk about mindset. Now, I always talk about mindset, so how's that different? Today we're going to try and define mindset. We're going to use a really basic definition. I am probably going to add to this definition in the future. And then we're going to take a section from Musashi where he addresses mindset. Then I'm going to tell you a story. Now, in my personal view, Musashi's entire book, The Book of Five Rings, the whole thing's about mindset. So we're not going to read the whole book because that would take several hours. According to Merriam-Webster, mindset is a mental attitude or inclination. Told you it was simple. It's a very simple definition. And again, we are going to add to this in the coming weeks. But we'll start with that. Now, for my purposes, from my viewpoint, from my background, we're looking at mindset as more of a willingness to act when something happens. I believe very strongly in having little plans in place that we can follow when something unexpected happens. Very simple example. And you might not think of this as mindset, but just bear with me. If you watch the whole video, hopefully I'll tie it all together and it'll all make sense. If you live in some kind of residence, you should have some kind of an idea of what you're going to do if there's a fire. You do not want to come up with a plan of what you're going to do if there's a fire when a fire happens. Now, hopefully, you will never need that plan, but you should have some idea of what you're going to do if there is something as unfortunate as a fire. Again, if it's a small fire, maybe you have a plan to put the fire out. If it's a fire you can't control, you need to have some idea of how you're going to get you and the people and possibly pets that you care about out of there. So, backing this up a little bit and bringing it back to Musashi, in the fire chapter, he has a section where he sets up a scenario where there's a criminal that's broken into a house and someone has to go into the house. And he's talking about how people process opposition. In The Logic of Failure, Dietrich Dorner has a statement where he says there is always an opponent, there is always opposition. Sometimes the opposition is another person, sometimes the opposition is circumstances, but there's always some kind of opponent. And our mindset is going to determine how we interact with that opponent and if we let ourselves get pushed around, or as I said the other day, if we're going to let life happen to us or if we're going to try to make things happen. Now, I'm going to read this section from Musashi real quick and we'll tie this up. He says, when you look at the world, people are apt to think that someone who has committed a robbery and has holed himself up in a house must be a strong opponent. Now, I taught self-defense for a long time. I trained with a lot of really good instructors. I've known Tony Blauer, I know Greg Hamilton, I know Jim Keating fairly well. I knew Eric Remen back when he was teaching. I've met Michael Janisch a couple times. You might not know any of those names, you might know all of them, it's not important. Just the point is, I trained with a lot of very educated people about the subject. We all address self defense not just from a physical level, but from a psychological and emotional level. And I can tell you that a lot of people have this idea that the opposition is strong. In a self defense situation, quite often the opposition, they might be intimidating, maybe, but they're often very weak people. If they were strong people, they would be doing brave things. They would not be trying to victimize other people. Keep in mind, this is a video, it's a broad audience. I'm generalizing. You might know a specific example that's different, but I'm talking about, bear in mind, we're talking about mindset. We're not just talking about physical attributes when we're talking about strength. Musashi goes on to say, but if you consider it from the opponent's view, he is thinking that the whole world is against him and that there is no way of escape. What Musashi is getting at here, from a mindset perspective, is people tend to think of that criminal or that obstacle, whatever it is, as being really strong and really powerful. And it could be intimidating and it might be physically strong. It might be abusive. It might be domineering. It could be really extroverted. There's a lot of, obviously, being extroverted isn't exclusively bad. I just mean it might have a strong personality. But typically, most of the time, that opposition probably has a frailty to it that we're not aware of. We're not going to go real deep on that today. Just, you might be aware of that already. If that's a new idea, just let it percolate. We're going to continue to talk about this. Finishing Musashi's quote, he says, the man who has holed himself up in a house is a pheasant. The man who is going in to cut him down is a hawk. A little bit later in the text, he says, you will be failing in something important if you think of your opponent as strong. Now, in saying that, I don't think Musashi is suggesting you should underestimate your opponent at all. It might sound like it's all over the place, but the point is understand that your opponent, your opposition, whatever it is, can also feel fear. Just because, especially if they're like really blustering and loud or something like that, don't take that to mean exclusively that they're brave and they're strong. A lot of times, brave people are pretty quiet and they don't feel a need to enforce their will on other people. They just do what they need to do. All right, story time. We'll see how this goes. Once upon a time, I was 19. I actually didn't have a beard at the time, if you can imagine that. I cannot. And I had gray hair at the time. I went gray early, but it wasn't this gray. So when I was 19, I was a member of a little Bible study. The Bible study went on a camping and river rafting trip, and I went on the trip. I've always enjoyed being outdoors. I had never been river rafting. I don't think I really knew what river rafting was when this trip got presented to me. The main reason I went on the trip was because there was a young woman who was going on the trip that I had a massive crush on. She didn't crush back, so don't get excited. We go on this trip. I think we camped for a day and then we went on the river raft thing. This was probably around 1992 or 1993. So this was at a time when you could not just get on the internet and look up river rafting and find out what it was and maybe watch a few helpful videos to figure out how to survive a river rafting trip. This was, I got there, I didn't know what was going on. A couple people get introduced to us and they tell us their guides while people are grabbing life jackets and different things. I don't think I was quite paying attention to the safety brief. You should always listen to the safety brief. At some point, dimly in the back of my mind, I heard someone say something along the lines of, if you get swept out of the raft, these are the kind of little things that should get your attention. So the guide told us that if we get swept out of a raft, we need to face downstream so we don't hit the back of our head on a rock. And you need to pick your feet up so that your feet don't get stuck in a rock. And so that if you happen to come upon a rock, you can push yourself off of the rock and not die a horrible death. Basically, all these little steps were to avoid dying a horrible death. I was 19, not a good swimmer, there because I like a girl. We all get in the raft, we're going on our thing. I think it started off pretty calm. I was sitting towards the back, and the guide was just to my right and behind me. So at some point, we found rapids. I don't remember what category they were, but I know that they exceeded whatever they were, it exceeded the experience of our little group. I don't think anyone in that group had been river rafting. I'm not sure, I'm not necessarily convinced that it didn't exceed the ability of our guide, even though he was a nice guy. Hope he's doing well. I guess he got us through it, but we hit this hole, and this wave comes up over the raft. Everyone in the raft, except for the guide and the guy sitting next to him, got knocked down. Everybody. Maybe 10 or 12 people in the raft. I don't remember. It was a pretty decent sized group. Everybody gets knocked down. I get sucked out of the raft, completely out of the raft. Young man doesn't really know how to swim, thankfully wearing a life jacket in the water. All right, so now we're getting into the part where this ties into mindset, where I talk about mindset being a willingness to act and how having a simple plan that you can follow can be a lifesaver. So once I'm in the water, I realize that I'm not facing the correct direction. I'm facing upstream. You're supposed to face downstream. So I turn around, I get my feet up, plan executed. Facing downstream, got my feet up. I'm not going to say that felt safe, but I accomplished that. At that point, I glance back over my shoulder and I see that the raft is extremely far behind me. I have no idea how the physics worked, where I got that far in front of the raft, but I was really far in front of the raft. Now, sometimes when we have a plan and we're following the plan, we're going to get a variable. Something's going to come up that we didn't plan on, and we have to deal with it. In this case, as I'm facing downstream, really focused on not dying a horrible death, something bumps into me. I turn over, it's the girl. It's the girl. So I glance over and I see her, and I can tell she is completely disorientated. Her eyes are wide, she's staring all over the place. I'd never assessed a situation like that prior to that, but I could tell she didn't know where she was. She told me later that she was pretty certain when she got knocked out of the boat, she actually went underneath the water and the raft went over her head. I don't know how you do that with a life jacket on, but you could tell she was pretty disorientated. She also told me later that when she bumped into me, she thought she was facing downstream, so she was really confused. Fortunately, she hit me and not a rock. At this point, I have three options. Option A, I can wave and watch her float by. Option B, I can wave and watch her float by while telling her she's doing it wrong. Or option C, I can reach over, grab her, pull her across, and hang on to her until we both get rescued. I will allow you a moment to ponder the outcome. Alright, if you guessed option C, good choice. If you guessed option A or option B, you have a sense of humor, that is not what happened. So after a while, I don't even know how long we were in the water. It wasn't that long. I hung onto her. She kind of gradually got orientated. The raft somehow caught up to us. They grabbed onto my life jacket. They pulled us both in. Everybody was fine. The rest of the trip was not less terrifying. It was just in the boat, but the rest of it was still pretty scary. It's one of those experiences where, like, after you survive it, you're glad that it happened because it adds a lot of texture to the trip. All right, so tying this in, mindset is a willingness to act. It's going to work best if you have a simple plan. Sometimes life will throw a variable at you, like someone that needs help that you're not counting on, and you've got to react to it. Taking this back to Musashi, if the opponent is a person, we don't want to underestimate the opponent. Keep in mind what Musashi said about the person that breaks into a house. People tend to think they're brave and they're strong, but in their head, they're trapped. They feel like they're going to be the ones that are going to be the victim. So the person that goes in is the hawk. The person who's waiting to get captured is a pheasant. If you've never thought about that before, give it some thought. And again, don't underestimate people, but don't make them just so powerful that you don't have a chance. If the opposition is a natural disaster like a fire or a flood or a whitewater rapid that you are absolutely not prepared to contend with, if you have a simple plan, execute the plan, keep your head on your shoulders, and your chances of getting through it are going to be much better. All right, that's all for today. Go read a book.